Good afternoon and welcome to Botany Beginners, Grasses for the Masses. Welcome back. I am Laura Jackson from University of Northern Iowa Tallgrass Prairie Center, and it is my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker today, Dr. Justin Meissen, who's going to be talking about cool season grasses of tallgrass prairies. Justin is the Research and Restoration Program Manager at the Tallgrass Prairie Center. He has a PhD in restoration ecology from the University of Minnesota, and his research focuses, among other things, on how to design native prairie seed mixes for the best, most diverse, most highly functional, and cost-effective restoration practices. We are in lecture 4, and Justin, if you could advance the slide. Just for those of you who are following along with the whole course, we're at the middle of the semester. We're about to have a mid-semester break here. We have been talking about cool season grasses in late June and early July, and this is the last of a series. There will be a break, and then beginning in late August, we will start talking about warm season grasses. I'll be giving that first lecture, and then we'll have 2 more guest lectures from the Tallgrass Prairie Center. Dr. Christine Nemec, who runs the program involving Iowa roadside management, and then finally Laura Fisher-Walter, who runs the plant materials program here at the Tallgrass Prairie Center. So today, welcome Justin, and we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
All right, great. Thank you, Laura. Today I just want to kind of introduce everybody to cool season grasses in tallgrass prairie remnants. So, we've been talking about cool season grasses for the past couple of weeks. We started talking about cool season grasses that you'd find, kind of everywhere, whether that's, a lawn or a pasture or a conservation planting or even in a prairie remnant. And then we talked a little bit more about species that are only something you're going to find in a prairie remnant or a conservation planting or a roadside where it kind of has been intentionally put there or planted there. And then today we want to talk about sort of the most restrictive of the categories. So the prairie remnants, the species that we are probably only going to find if we're able to go out and explore Iowa's prairie remnants or upper Midwestern prairie remnants. But Iowa in particular, we're going to be talking about those species that are characteristic or unique of our prairie remnants in Iowa. So we'll talk about a couple of those key species, and we'll also be using the keys in the Brown and Ellman book to key out a couple cool season grasses that we'll be calling our plants of the day. So with all that said, I think we can go ahead and begin with our first discussion here about kind of cool season grasses in general in tallgrass prairies. So when you think about all of the grass species that, I guess, quote unquote true grasses in the Poaceae family, about half of them are cool season grasses, the other half being warm season grasses. Of course, this doesn't include sedges or rushes, which you would really change those numbers if you included those. But when you think about just the true grasses, the poll book, Grasses of Iowa, kind of identifies about 43 grasses that are characteristic of tallgrass prairies. Now, that's not to say that there are only 43 grasses you're likely to find in a tallgrass prairie, but you're definitely going to find many, many more than that. But 43 is about what the number is of the species that you typically find in a tallgrass prairie, or what you'd call characteristic of tallgrass prairies. So about half of those grass species are cool season, and about half of those half are actually only two genera, which are Dicanthelium and Elmis, or the wild rise, which we covered earlier in the course. So you already know the wild rye group. For example, Virginia wild rye, Canada wild rye are also important in prairie remnants as well, even though they're typically not very common in a prairie remnant. And also the Dicanthelium. So we're going to talk about the panic grasses. There are a lot of those species, and they're typically very difficult to tell apart. But we'll just focus on the two of the most common ones that you'd find in Iowa prairie remnants, and so you'll be equipped to at least figure out one or two. Okay, so when we're talking about cool season grasses in tallgrass prairies, the kinds of prairies also kind of help us delineate what cool season grasses are likely to be found there. And so when you kind of break it up, about half of the cool season grass species are found in dry prairies, and about half of them are in wet or mesic prairies, or medium soil prairies. Now we've been talking about species, so the number of species, and while that's pretty high, and half of the grasses are cool season grasses, that's the actual amount of those grasses, or the abundance that you're likely to find when you say walk through a prairie. That's much different than the number of species that are possibly found. So the cool season grass abundance in a tallgrass prairie remnant is typically much lower. So you're still going to be finding, by and large, a lot more warm season grasses in a tallgrass prairie remnant than you are cool season grasses. You're certainly not likely to find 50% of the stems out there being cool season grasses. And that all sort of comes to this conclusion that cool season grasses and tallgrass prairie remnants are sometimes easy to overlook. So they might be generally uncommon, or they are common, but they're really quite small. And we're going to talk about mostly the common but small ones, but some also uncommon ones too. Okay, so let's begin with our first plant of the day. Okay, so to sort of set the scene here, so this is out at a sand prairie, so Cedar Hills Sand Prairie here nearby the University of Northern Iowa. And this is in late June. And we're out here sort of on the top of a ridge. You can tell it's a sand prairie or some kind of a dry prairie based on, there's a good amount of open ground that we can see. Vegetation's pretty short. Seems like there's one dominant grass here, but it looks like, based on what we're seeing, those stems are old stems from last year, and the green growth is still pretty early. There's not too much growth at this point. So that's probably a warm season grass. And so we're unlikely to have the characteristics to be able to really positively identify that species. So let's see if we can find a grass that is flowering that we might be able to key out. And if we look hard, we'll find this small little grass, which is about a foot or so tall, and that one is in flower. So we can try to key that out. Okay, so we're going to run through the key in the Brown and Elman book. And so first thing we start off with is we have a round stem. So I want to look to see if there are branches in the inflorescence. So at first glance, it really doesn't look like it. So, but we do want to note that we want to make sure to look closely so that we're just not missing the branches. So we're going to take a closer look. Okay, so closer look at the inflorescence. Still doesn't really look like it's branched, but just for posterity's sake, let's take an even closer look. Now that we really have zoomed in here, we can actually see a good amount of branching in that inflorescence. It's pretty small, but it is definitely branching. So we can kind of cross this first group off the list. Now we check to see if we have the flower branches coming out from one point. Nope. It's not coming out the side of the stem. And so we have flower branches being arranged vertically along the stem. So we're going to go with that group on page 27. Okay, so ask ourselves a couple questions here. Are the flowers lined up to one side? No, they're pretty well distributed all around the stem. Are the branches all along the stem, starting near the bottom, kind of mixed in with the leaves? Nope, this is definitely terminal inflorescence at the very top of the stem, without any indication that there's leaves nearby. Are the plants big, over 6 feet tall? Definitely not. This one was about a foot tall, so very small. Okay, so does the inflorescence droop? No, this is pretty upright. So that gets us to this group, the upright, non-drooping branches. And so we'll work through this group. So we want to ask ourselves whether the inflorescence is round or bunchy. No, this is definitely cylindrical. Is the inflorescence sparse and delicate? No, this is definitely very compact. Okay, so here's something that looks pretty good. The inflorescence is straight and narrow, and the branches hug the stem. That definitely seems like it fits the bill. So we'll work through these species. You know, we don't have a key to get us any further, so we'll have to go through each of the species in the book and kind of work through that list. So the first one is Anthoxanthum, which this is not that species in the book is an introduced pasture grass that has vanilla scent. It's definitely not that. So how about Colaria? And indeed, that is what this species is. This is June grass, Colaria macrantha. So as we go throughout the day, we're going to kind of hit on some of the characteristics of the plants. You know, we'll talk about some general characteristics. We'll discuss vegetative characteristics, floral characteristics, and then we'll talk about the range. So where does this plant exist in Iowa, in North America, and in the world? And then we'll talk about some of the uses for humans and wildlife as well. So we'll kind of keep that same format as we go along through all the different cool season grasses that we're going to talk about. So June grass, also known as crested hair grass, is a very small little grass, only about a foot tall, barely gets to be 2 feet. And it's, you know, when we talk about growth habit, that's sort of how the plant grows. So how does it kind of grow in relation to all of its other stems, where the stems go? So this is a perennial tuft or bunch grass. And so, you know, some of the classic tallgrass prairie bunch grasses you've already looked at, you know, big blue stem, depending on where you're looking at it. Cydotes grama, those are typically, you find those as bunches, again, depending on the context, but and those are sort of these where the stems are all very close together in a clump, in a cluster of stems, whereas other things, like the things you've covered before, like reed canary grass or quack grass, those are sod forming grasses. And Popertensis, bluegrass, those are all sod forming grasses, so they don't really have a clumping form. they just kind of a lot of the time grow underground and stick up stems here and there. Sometimes they create really big colonies. So that's what we mean by growth habit. And the June grass is a perennial bunch grass, or particularly not hugely bunchy, more of a tuft. So it's not really a hard and fast scientific distinction between a tuft and a bunch. It just kind of gets at the how many stems are all packed in together. So there's a little bit fewer stems packed together in the tuft. So fruiting season. So this puts its fruits out in June through July, and it flowers in June, hence the name June grass here in Iowa. So let's look at some of the vegetative characteristics. We have here the stem and the leaves and the bunch grass form here. So it's kind of a variable plant. It's got sometimes has fine hairs along the stems and the sheaths in particular, and also the leaves sometimes, but it is variable. So that's not a great character to go by. One thing you'll note here, though, is it has somewhat of a interesting leaf venation. So if you look at a leaf, all grasses have these parallel veins that run along the leaf, and some grasses have really hard to find veins. Some of them look like a piece of paper, and some of them have strong veins that show up, as these run down the leaf. And this is a good example of a species with pretty strong venation in the leaf. So you can really see the veins as they run across the leaf. So, and then again, the leaves are basal only. So you won't see any of the leaves going up the flower stem, which a lot of grasses do that. Okay, so looking at the inflorescences and the flowers again, dense and narrow inflorescence. There are not too many tallgrass prairie species that have this sort of an inflorescence. And then also the flower scales in the inflorescence on the flowers are sort of papery, and then the lowest ones, there are different ranks of flower scales typically on each flower. We won't really get into that because it kind of takes a long time to go through all that anatomy, and we don't really need to get into that kind of a detail. But suffice to say that the lowest rank of those scales is about as long as all the rest of them. So we can see that here with our orange lines. So you can see those scales are about the same size as the rest of them. Okay, so habitat and distribution. So where are we likely to find June grass? Both in a region, but also what kind of a habitat is it likely to be found in? So tallgrass prairie, upland tallgrass prairie. So primarily we're looking at drier soils, though it can be found in some more medium soils depending on the location. And it's found all across Iowa, but it is a little bit less common in the east. And it has a coefficient of conservatism of 8. So what I mean by coefficient of conservatism is, so that is a sort of a score that we use to designate how a plant species is able to cope with disturbance, and how a plant species is sort of requires high quality habitat to live. So a higher coefficient of conservatism means that a plant species is sort of only found in high quality habitat like a tallgrass prairie remnant. So this coefficient of conservatism is 8 out of 10. So 10 is the highest you can get. And so that indicates that June grass is a pretty conservative species. So as far as its range goes, where does it grow? And talked about Iowa, but in particular, it's also very circumboreal. So we have a range that's actually, almost worldwide in a sense, and we'll talk about that. Okay, so this is the range map of North America, and so we see June grass basically extends from the Midwest all the way out to the West Coast, and so it's tallgrass prairie plant. It's a Great Plains plant, shortgrass prairie plant, and a mountain alpine plant as well. And so pretty wide range where you might find it. Now we can even zoom out farther to look at the range map of the world. So if we think about June grass as a tallgrass prairie plant or prairie plant in general, kind of missing a little bit of the picture because it's, like I said, circumboreal. So it basically is native to most of the northern hemisphere. So you're likely to find June grass in a similar situation in China as you would in Iowa, basically potentially in roadsides or grasslands rather, in all kinds of places around the world. So this is its native distribution. What are some of the uses for this grass? So for wildlife, it's forage for wildlife and livestock. Because it's such a small grass, not really a huge component of a typical diet. And it's also useful as a component in prairie reconstructions and prairie seed mixes, but really more as a minor component. So it has got a really wide commercial availability. Again, it's a cool season grass, so that fills an important seasonal gap that we typically find in seed mixes of reconstructions. But it is a really poor competitor with larger plants. So we saw it in its habitat, natural habitat, and it's really only about a foot tall, and it's not really able to compete with larger vegetation. So its ability to persist in a tallgrass prairie restoration is potentially fairly low, except for situations where you have low nutrients, like a really sandy site or a place where there's a lot of open ground naturally. But it's also a good landscaping plant. So the things that make it a poor competitor make it a nice landscaping plant. So it's short. It's got that nice bunching format, sort of interesting looking inflorescences, and it is a little bit shade tolerant. Okay, so let's move on to our next species here. So this is Prairie Brome, or Bromus calmii. Other names you might see this as listed as Callum's brome or Arctic brome. Another pretty small plant, about 3 feet tall. And again, this is a perennial tuft or bunch grass. The fruiting season is a little bit longer here, and a little bit later than June grass, July to September, and it flowers in June in Iowa. So taking a look at the vegetative characters, we see it has quite a lot of hair on the stems, or not the stems, but the sheaths, the joints, the blades of the leaves. And like most bromes, certainly Iowa bromes, it has this our classic W-shaped leaf indentation. So maybe we can see that a little bit if we zoom in. But that's something you'd find on smooth brome for sure. And so remember, if you're, using this shortcut, as it is a shortcut to get to the brome genus, a lot of the times, remember that there are other bromes out there, so it's not going to be a foolproof method to get to any one species. And it's also got that closed sheath that we talked about. So just like smooth brome and other bromes, this closed sheath here is something that we see in that genus, and this species is no exception. Okay, so let's take a look at the way that the flowers and inflorescence looks. So it's a really droopy inflorescence, and has these bristles on the flower scales that you can see here. They're fairly small or short, but they're definitely there. And then those flower scales are also very hairy, very dense hair, very soft hair. It's pretty pleasant grass to touch. As far as its habitat and distribution, again, upland tallgrass prairies, just more medium to dry soils, it's able to tolerate a little bit more moisture. And in Iowa, it's more common in the Northeast. So we talked about coefficient of conservatism. This has a coefficient of conservatism of 10, so that's the maximum. So this is a very conservative species that is really only found in tallgrass prairies or other high quality habitats like tallgrass prairies. And its primary range is in the upper Midwest, but also it'll show up in the east a little bit. And let's take a look at that. So you can see here this species is, like I say, mostly kind of centered around the Great Lakes. In Iowa, it's got, again, mostly northeastern distribution, but some of the northern counties and the central Des Moines lobe counties have some occurrences as well. And it's got a little disjunct population, it looks like, in the Black Hills of South Dakota, but also some spots out to the east. And this is a good place to talk about what we're looking at when we're looking at these range maps. So you got 3 different colors, actually 4 different colors. The color to really focus on is the bright green. That's the county level record for the occurrence of this species. So the dark green just shows the state, if it's found in the state. And it's not very helpful a lot of the time. So for example, if we look at North Dakota, there are 2 counties in the far northeast where it's found. You wouldn't really say this is a plant that you'd likely find in North Dakota, except for some very small spots. So kind of misleading if you just look at the state level record. You really want to get as fine of a record as you can, and counties can be pretty useful to develop that picture. So, and then there's also 2 other colors that are of interest, 3 actually. Yellow, so yellow and orange sort of designate threatened and endangered status in a given state. And I believe yellow is threatened, and I think orange might be state endangered. So you can see up in the Northeast, that's definitely not a common plant. And then if you actually look in South Carolina, there is 1 record that's got a teal color, and those are what you'd call adventive records. So it's a plant native to the region in general, but the occurrence is probably not actually part of its native range. So who knows how it got there, but it's not likely to be naturally found in South Carolina. Okay, worldwide, fairly restricted range, just sort of focused around the Great Lakes upper Midwest and Northeast North America. So, you know, there are, I would say, there's a lookalike of Prairie Brome out there, and there are definitely other native bromes that are of high quality habitats that it could be confused with, but such as Bromus ciliatus. But we're going to talk about one that is easier, I think, or more likely to be confused, or not necessarily confused, but more likely to be encountered and confused with Prairie Brome, which would be Japanese brome. You know, at first glance, they're both softly hairy. They're about the same height, about 1 to 3 feet tall. They have that really droopy inflorescence, and they have a sort of that small bunch growth. But there's pretty good ways to tell them apart. And the main way to tell them apart is the length of these bristles on the flower scales. So in Japanese brome, and to a greater extent in cheatgrass, the annual bromes have really long bristles on the flower scales, whereas Prairie Brome, they really have pretty small ones. And of course, the Prairie Brome is perennial, and the Japanese brome is annual. But you're probably going to encounter Prairie Brome on a Prairie remnant, so you can't really use the annual test that we talked about in Botany Beginners from last year, which is you take a stem of the grass and you pull it out of the ground, see if there's any appreciable root mass that comes up with it. Of course, we can't do that in a prairie remnant. We need to be keeping prairie remnants in good shape, so we aren't really able to do that. But you can really use the habitat characteristics of where you find it pretty well to know that if you're in a tallgrass prairie remnant without disturbance, it's definitely going to be Prairie Brome. If you're in an area with disturbance, it could be Japanese brome. More likely, if it's not in a prairie remnant, probably Japanese brome. Okay, so some of the other uses for Prairie Brome. So the seeds, you know, based on what we know about other native bromes, the large seeds of the species are probably eaten by upland game birds, sparrows, small rodents, and the vegetation is good forage for rabbits, deer, elk, and livestock. I think this plant has a lot of great potential for prairie reconstruction. It is somewhat commercially available. There are not very many Iowa ecotypes, though they have been in the trade in the past, or other sort of lower, you know, upper Midwest species ecotypes. A lot of the seed lots that are readily available are from far in the north. Some Canadian material, which I would say is advisable to use in Iowa. But it typically has very reliable seedling establishment, and definitely persists for at least a couple of years. Long-term persistence, I'm not quite sure how well it persists, but so far so good. I think, you know, the research is ongoing, but I think this is a great species to add to any restoration seed mix. Especially for upland prairies. It's also got, I think, got some landscaping potential. You know, it's got short stature, a little bit of shade tolerance. And it's got this nice sort of drooping, interesting inflorescence. Okay, so our next plant here is going to be porcupine grass. So Hesperus stipa spartea. Got a lot of other common names: porcupine needlegrass, big needlegrass. Is also about 3 feet tall, kind of in the short range of things in the tallgrass prairie. And again, it's a perennial tuft or bunch grass. You can kind of see that here with this picture of the grass right here. And like the species we've been talking about so far, fruiting season has been generally June and July, with flowering in June. So you'll be noticing that really the best time to be out looking for this stuff was last month, unfortunately. But you'll probably still be able to find some traces of this plant, especially in the way that the old flowering stems kind of stick up from the rest of the vegetation and this sort of like ghostly skeletal aspect. It's definitely something that you'll see if you look for it. Sort of the stem and leaf characteristics here. Smooth stems, sheaths, and leaves, not a hairy plant. The leaves are really narrow, and they come to the long thread-like tip. They have this sandpapery feel. So like the June grass, it has pretty strong venation that you see here in the leaves. But this one you can really kind of see if you look closely. There's these almost like hooks or teeth along the margins and along the veins. And it really shows how sandpapery it can feel when you rub your fingers the wrong way on that thing. So inflorescence and flowers, there's really nothing else like it, at least in most of Iowa. There's one species, needle and thread grass, which does look a little bit like this, but it's pretty uncommon anywhere except the far western part of the state, and it's definitely much more common farther to the west. It's got porcupine grass, it's got that drooping inflorescence, and those bristles on the flower scales are just incredibly long. It's really like nothing else that you're likely to find in an upland prairie. Okay, so the seeds of porcupine grass are quite interesting. So they are what give you the name porcupine grass, because they are extremely sharp. They really are needles. And if you've ever walked through a prairie remnant in late June when all these seeds are ready to be shed, and you walk through a field of these porcupine grass, it's very painful. So you'll get them up in your socks, and it's like needles everywhere. It's kind of it's a painful experience, but it is a cool experience. So the reason that it's painful in some ways is that those seeds are, if we go back and look, they are on the plant looking like this, and once they are ripe, their awns they remain straight, and they kind of just fall out of the seed head like that. But over time, with changes in moisture in the atmosphere, that awn, or that long bristle, twists, and it actually drills the seed into the soil by the twisting action. And it's a pretty interesting and unique way of getting seeds dispersed into the soil. So yeah, if you do, probably a little late now, but next year, if you find some porcupine grass seed that's close to ripe, if you pick it, the day that you pick it, and you just let it sit in the car for a couple hours, it'll twist itself up into this configuration in a couple hours, typically if it's dry enough. Okay, so habitat and distribution of porcupine grass, mostly upland tallgrass prairie. This one is able to live in more medium soils typically, but also does well in dry soils. It is also occasionally found on roadsides and railroad right-of-ways, not particularly commonly, but it does show up there every once in a while. This one's also common across Iowa. Got a coefficient of conservatism of 7 out of 10. And its range primarily tracks the tallgrass prairie region. as well as some of the mixed prairie regions a little bit farther west. So here's a map of that. So, this porcupine grass also is related to needle grass, and it's part of this continuum that ecologists have used to describe the prairie in general of North America. The Tallgrass Prairie, which of course we are in Iowa, and that gives way to the mixed grass prairie, and then finally shortgrass prairie once you kind of hit the front range of the Rockies. And so the porcupine grass is a indicator or a good example of a tallgrass prairie needle grass. And as we were talking about earlier, the needle and thread grass is definitely more of a mixed grass and shortgrass species. So in the mixed grass region, you have both porcupine grass and needle and thread grass, but those two kind of help delineate the differences in prairie types as you move from east to west. Okay, worldwide, it's again restricted to central and northern parts of North America, which is a true North American prairie grass. As far as its uses, it is a forage for a variety of herbivores, livestock included, but of course, it's probably not going to be your go-to pasture grass given its issues with those sharp seeds, which can get embedded in fur and the skin of animals. This is a species that I would say is undeveloped in terms of its potential for prairie reconstruction. It's a very important grass in tallgrass prairies, and I think it should be in as many prairie reconstructions as it could, but there are definitely barriers to actually getting it in a seed mix based on how difficult those long twisting awns or bristles that we showed earlier. That makes cleaning that seed really hard. It makes collecting the seed really hard, and so if we have some work to do to come up with ways to overcome those barriers efficiently. So until that happens, most of our prairie reconstructions will probably not have too much porcupine grass, even though a prairie remnant typically has quite a lot of it. Okay, I think now is a good time for a botany break. I'll field any questions that you guys might have. And maybe I'll take a look at the chat, or Ann or Andy can help me out with any questions that might have come up while we're working. Let's see, I don't see any questions that haven't already been answered. So I'll look at the chat real quick here for another minute. And if we don't get any, we'll go ahead and keep moving. Okay, so question we have about how do porcupine grass and needle grass differ morphologically? So in general, needle and thread grass is a little bit smaller, and it's got shorter flower scales, and those big long bristles are a little bit shorter. So they're quite similar, but once you, I think this general size is usually the most obvious way to tell them apart. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and keep moving. So we're going to do a second plant of the day, which is this grass here. We're in a prairie remnant, and we see this depression. This is back at Cedar Hill Sand Prairie. This area is probably a lot wetter than the other spot. So we can see that there's one species here that appears to be pretty dominant. So let's see what we can figure out what that is. So here's a picture of the inflorescence, and we're going to work through the key in our textbook, Brown element. So check to see if it's got branches that no branches. We definitely have branches, so we can keep moving on this. The branches are not forking from one point or the top, not out the side. Definitely arranged vertically along the stem. They're not to one side, they're not mixed up with the leaves, and they're not particularly big, not drooping. So that brings us to our group with upright inflorescences. You can look into whether this is round inflorescence. It's not. How about sparse delicate? I would say it's a pretty delicate inflorescence, but this other aspect of this group, a little overlap among the flowers and the branches. It definitely looks like there's quite a bit of overlap in the flowers and the branches. So don't think that's going to be it. So let's see. Is it are the branches hugging the stem? No, they're definitely sort of laid out flat like this here. So this is not a good fit. Okay, so that brings us to our last part of the key, which is yeah, we have a diamond shaped inflorescence. So we're going to have to look at the bristles, flower scales, whether they have bristles or not. So here's a picture of the bristles, and we can see that maybe they're pointed, but they don't really have significant bristles at the tip of those flower scales. So we're going to skip to flower scales with no bristles. Don't have time to go through all of these, so I'm just going to reveal this is Calamagrostis canadensis. Okay, so this has got a lot of different common names. I'll just say that if you can, try to learn the scientific name. I always try to make sure that I put the scientific name with the common name whenever I refer to plants, because the scientific name is, there's only one of those, but there can be infinite number of common names. So this blue joint, also known as marsh pine grass, meadow pine grass, Canadian reedgrass, all kinds of different names for the same plant. So if you want to be sure of what you're talking about with someone else, use a scientific name if you can remember it. So if you're going to remember one name of plants, try to remember the scientific name. Okay. So this is a taller plant, a little bit taller, about 4 feet tall. And this is our first sod-forming perennial native plant, I think, that we've covered in the course. But again, it's similar to reed canary grass or quack grass in that it's rhizomatous, and it can form these really large colonies. So let's see. So the fruiting season here is a little bit later, July to August, and then flowering with into June and July here in Iowa. If we look at the vegetative characters, it is quite smooth throughout the joint sheaths and blades. And the leaves have pretty prominent veins as well, and they're kind of long, tapering to sharp point. And there is where the blade meets the stem here, this appendage, which we call a ligule, is really large and papery, and that will become important when we compare it to other plants. So again, looking at the inflorescence, initially it's diamond shape, but as it no longer is flowering and it moves more to the seed phase, those branches start to hug the stem afterwards. So it can make it kind of tricky when you're trying to identify the species based on the flowers. So that the key no longer really helps you if you that we talked about if we wait too long. So it's kind of tricky. Habitat and distribution of blue joint. It is it's our first wet tallgrass prairie species. So you'll find it in remnant depressions and swales and prairies, but also a wide variety of other wet habitats like swamps and fens and such. It's common across the state. It's got a coefficient of conservatism of 6. And its primary range is pretty widespread across North America. So having a look here at the range map, kind of the mountains in the west and southwest, northwest, the upper Midwest, and the Northeast is, at least in the United States, where this species can be found. And then worldwide, it can get all the way up into Greenland, so it's very much a northern species. And interestingly enough, looks like it's been introduced to the Kashmir region of India. So potentially an issue out in Asia. So lookalikes, I think that blue joint, I think Calamagrostis canadensis looks like Canary grass sometimes, certainly at first glance. But there are definitely ways to tell them apart. But they are similar, they inhabit the same kinds of habitats. They grow, in large colonies, and they both have that tall appendage where the leaf meets the stem. They have a similar inflorescence and seed head, color and general shape once they've no longer flowering. And so how do you tell them apart? Really, the main way to tell them apart is the size of the leaves. So in Canada, Calamagrostis canadensis, you have pretty thin leaves. You have thin leaves that are about the size of a shoestring, or like the round dress shoelaces. Whereas in reed canary grass, you got much wider leaves. So something that are get up to the size of like a piece of masking tape. So it's a pretty big difference in leaf width. So with that in mind, let me know in the chat, taking a look at this picture from a prairie remnant, which side of the picture is dominated by reed canary grass and which is dominated by Calamagrostis canadensis. Okay, this is the answer. So reed canary grass on the left and blue joint is on the right. So it's useful for forage for wildlife and livestock, and it's important in prairie constructions, especially in wet areas. However, it's important to use a high seeding rate when you are seeding with this due to the really tiny seeds that it has. Okay, so for the last two plants that we're going to cover today, we'll be talking about the Dicantheliums. So we're going to start out with Dicanthelium lyburgii, Liber expanded grass. Again, it's a little plant. It's only about 2 feet tall, and it's a perennial bunch or tuft grass. And its fruiting season is June to July, and it flowers in June here in Iowa. Now you notice that I have added this word vernal to the fruiting season, and that's because Dicantheliums actually have two growth phases. So they have a spring growth phase or a vernal phase where their primary flowering and seed set occurs. And then they have a secondary phase in the autumn, so autumnal phase, in September or so. And unfortunately for us, when we're trying to identify things, they can look different based on which growth phase they're in. So we're just going to focus on the spring one. So so if you go out in September, you might see this species, but it'll look different. So we're just going to focus on springtime. Okay, so this is a pretty, I guess it's somewhat unique in the fact that it has almost all of the surfaces of this grass have long hairs with pimple-like bases on the sheaths. Nodes, both these surfaces in flower scales. So most of this plant is covered with these pimple-based hairs. And if you look at them, they are really quite similar to the hairs that you see on Cytogramma or Bouteloua curvipendula. They have a bump at the bottom of them. And so if you recall that, that's similar to what you'd see with this species. Looking at the inflorescence and the flowers, again, it's got those hairy flower scales with pimple-like bases of the hairs. And the inflorescence is sparse, wiry, naked branches, really only a few flowers given the size of the inflorescence. Habitat distribution of Dicanthelium lyburgii, like a lot of the other ones we've talked about today, upland tallgrass prairies. You can find this one in medium to dry soils, mostly all across Iowa, but it is most common in the northwest part of the state. Got a coefficient of conservatism of 8 out of 10. And as far as range is concerned, it's pretty much focused, fairly restricted to the upper Midwest. So here's an example here of what we're dealing with. So really it's just Iowa and surrounding states. So it's a pretty small range that I think has some implications for conservation and restoration that we want to think about. As far as worldwide, again, pretty restricted range. And it's a good source of, like all Dicantheliums, probably a good source of seed food for upland game birds and granivorous songbirds. But as far as prairie reconstruction use, it's really undeveloped. We don't know much about this species, how to get it into commercial seed production, because there is no commercial availability at the time. But like I said, it's conservation wise, because it is such a remnant dependent plant and it is got such a small range. I think it's important to get this plant into commercial seed production. So, any possibility of extinction can be mitigated through reconstructions if necessary. So, also, it's again a cool season grass fills an important seasonal gap for us in reconstructions. Okay, so the last grass we're going to cover today is Scribner's panic grass, or Dicanthelium oligocanthes. Another small Dicanthelium, about 2 feet tall, perennial bunch tuft grass. And fruiting season is June to September. Flowering again in June and July here in Iowa. Well, this doesn't really have any telltale characteristics to help us with the identification vegetatively, because it's very variable in the amount of hairiness that it has on the leaves and the sheaths. But usually the hairs are long and spreading on the sheaths, but has at least a smooth leaf surface. Inflorescence wise, this is where we can actually use a pretty easy to remember trick to know this species. So again, like all Dicantheliums, it has that sparse, wiry inflorescence. But Dicanthelium oligocanthes has this pink-purple spot on the base of at least some flower scales typically. Now, you're not always going to find it, but it is definitely something that's easy to see in a lot of situations. So this is one that you can pretty easily remember. If it's got a pink purple spot at the base of the flower scale, probably dealing with Dicanthelium oligocanthes, especially if you're in a tallgrass prairie remnant. Habitat, again, upland tallgrass prairies. Medium to dry soils, more on the dry side in my experience. It's common across Iowa. This one has a coefficient of conservatism of 5 out of 10, so this one is less conservative. It's less reliant on tallgrass prairie remnants, but it is a little bit more tolerant of disturbance. And its primary range is fairly widespread east of the Rocky Mountains, and let's take a look at that. So here's our range map. As you can see, common through most of the Midwest, parts of the Northeast, Southeast, Southwest even, and Northwest. Kind of got an interesting range map here. Worldwide, doesn't really expand too much, mostly just most of North America. And it is introduced in Czech Republic and Slovakia, which isn't super surprising based on the fact that they have some grasslands over there that are somewhat similar in conditions that I would expect to see in some of our shorter tallgrass prairie habitats as well. So looking at some of the uses of Dicanthelium oligocanthes, again, for seed source, food source for upland game birds and songbirds. And like Dicanthelium lyburgii, don't really know much about this for species for reconstruction, but I think it's definitely a species that should be pursued to try to get this into commercial availability and into more seed mixes. Okay, so with that, I am finished with talking about all of our plants today. So my advice to you is to go explore a prairie remnant. Look for some of these species. You can find some of the prairie remnants close to you in your county. The Iowa Prairie Network. So iowaprairienetwork.org, find a prairie. We'll give you a list of some of the prairies that might be close by to you. Not all of them are remnants, but there's usually a description that helps you figure out which ones are. And a couple of things that you can do now in July. As we pointed out, really the best time to do, to identify cool season grasses and prairie remnants is in June, when everything's flowering. But there's still some interesting stuff that we can find. For example, you could probably look for some Dicantheliums beginning their autumnal phase. You at least know how to identify Dicantheliums in general, that sparse wiry inflorescence, and you might be able to find those as they start their new phase in the summer. You can also find these ghost stems that I like to think of them, porcupine grass. Porcupine grass, old stems are very white, and they just stick up throughout the prairie. This is an example of how they look probably around this time of year in prairie remnants. This one is out at Broken Kettle grasslands in far western Iowa, but you can see all of these kind of ghostly stems that are the old seed heads that had just seeded the porcupine grass. So if you follow the ghost stems of those plants, you'll be able to see the basal leaves, which are still growing. And you can find those tufts of porcupine grass at the base. So still some stuff to do out there. So yeah, I would encourage everyone to go explore prairie remnant, take a look at the cool season grasses and the remnants of the cool season grasses to be found. And yeah, post some pictures in the Google Groups Facebook page. That'd be great. So at this point, I'll open it up to questions. If anyone has questions, I'll look at the chat here real quick. So some questions here. I see currently we got a question about, or a comment that Liebherg's panic grass is not in Brown and Elman. That is correct. They're only the 2 plants of the day we looked at are in Brown and Elman. The rest are not in the textbook. So the follow-up here was, how can we distinguish either of these from Dicanthelium clandestinum? I wouldn't suggest trying to do that. It would be a pretty difficult endeavor that will require keys, microscopes, and forceps. So like I said, the Dicantheliums are pretty tough to differentiate. I suppose the way you would differentiate it from the other Dicantheliums are the way we talked about Dicanthelium Liebhergii having pimple-based hairs on the flower scales is a pretty good character that differentiates it from all the other Dicantheliums, but that does require a hand lens or a microscope. Question here, any tips on seeing ligules? Yeah, they can be tough to find or tough to see. Hand lens, some means of magnification. Those are probably big enough you could find with a regular old magnifying glass. Some other means of magnification. You don't typically have to get, it depends on what you're looking for in the ligules. If you're trying to find some of the really small characteristics, like does it have a ragged top? That's something you'd have to use a hand lens for. But just to kind of examine it, see if it's papery or what have you, or cartilaginous. You can always use your fingers, but also just a magnifying glass, I think, could help to see it a little more clearly. Okay. Any other questions before I close out the lecture and hand it back over to Laura Jackson? All right, well, thanks everybody. It was fun to share some of these grasses with you, and have a good break, and get excited for warm season grasses to start coming up.
Thank you so much, Justin. This was a lot of fun, and we saw a lot of really cool grasses. Yes, keep sending those pictures of you out in the field with the grasses that you found, your tentative IDs. You're doing a fantastic job. I read and look at every one of them, and it's just so fun to see what you're finding out there in the field. So keep up the good work, and we'll stay in touch via the Google Groups and the Facebook page. And but look forward to seeing you back here on August 19th. And that will do it for today.